Right. Let's see. 16 minutes before 12 o'clock. Hey, this morning there was a story about Johnny Reb, the statue in the Veterans Park here in Ocala, having been painted on with spray paint. It was graffiti. Some vandals or did something or whatever.
Yeah, disgusting. Defacing it.
And so one of the things they painted on the statue was a number. I don't know why they painted 575 on the statue, but I thought, this is Black History Month, and the number 575 rung a bell for me, and so I had to Google it in order to remind myself. And so I wanted to share the story that you may already know. I was not a good history student, but if you didn't, I think you'll find it interesting. If you did, maybe there are some pieces in the story that are new to you. If you saw the film Glory, there was a powerful closing scene in which, after failing to take Fort Wagner, members of the all-black 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry and their white officers are buried together on a beach in South Carolina. Did you see that movie?
No, I did not. I know it was a blockbuster, though. I've never seen it. I would like to.
The film leaves the viewer with a very powerful image of the sacrifice of African American soldiers and their white officers during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. It does not address the fate of those members of the 54th Massachusetts who were captured that day in 1863. The entrance of black troops into the Civil War following the Emancipation Proclamation placed the Confederate authorities in a difficult dilemma. Think about this now. What would you do if you had a Union soldier fighting against you and you captured him as a prisoner of war and he was African American? What do you do when you take that person prisoner? Mm-hmm. In his almost 2-year battle to convince the government to allow African Americans to fight, Frederick Douglass, the guy you just saw on my screen here, Robin, with the crazy hair.
Yeah.
Good man, but crazy hair. He said, once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on the earth or under the earth which can deny that he has earned the right of citizenship in the United States. Anyway, he equated military service with manhood and citizenship, and his thoughts, his philosophy was not lost on Confederate authorities. The Confederacy could not treat captured black soldiers from the Union Army in the same way that they treated the white soldiers from the Union Army when they were captured, because if they did that, it would legitimize them, the black soldiers, as both soldiers and men, which they were not willing to do. It would also be an inadvertent way to accept the Emancipation Proclamation. And therefore, 8 days before the Emancipation Proclamation was to go into effect, Jefferson Davis stated, and you remember him, he was the president of the Confederacy, quote, all Negro slaves captured in arms be at once delivered over to the executive authorities of the respective states to which they belong. A resolution later adopted by the Confederate Congress provided that all, quote, Negroes or mulattoes, unquote, slave or free, taken in arms should be tried for inciting service insurrection and be subject to the death penalty. I was born in 1955. When you think about this, how recent this actually was, how so crazy this sounds, and yet I was born less than a century after this happened.
Yeah, because people that fought during the Civil War did live in 1955.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did live in 1955.
Yeah. We've had some former slaves that were still alive when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. Confederate policy highlighted one of President Lincoln's concerns about enlisting black men as combat soldiers in the Union Army. Lincoln initially planned to station black troops in areas where they would not likely see combat, but black soldiers sought to get into the fight, resulting in the assault on Fort Wagner, that is part of the movie Glory that I told you about. Mm-hmm. Following the Confederate Congress's resolution declaring that captured black soldiers, quote, ready for this, be put to death or otherwise punished rather than held as prisoners of war.
Oh, my God.
So they were fighting knowing that they would either get killed or captured. If they were lucky, they wouldn't have either. But their white counterparts who got captured would be treated as prisoners of war. They would not. They were looking into the face of death either way.
That's so horrible, horrible.
Anyway, Lincoln declared that the law of nations permit no distinction as to color in the treatment of prisoners of war. This is Lincoln now, not Jefferson Davis. And if the Confederacy executed a Union soldier, he said, the Union would retaliate in kind if the Confederacy enslaved a Union soldier. A Confederate prisoner would be placed in hard labor. So he tried to give them an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth way to protect his soldiers, whether they were African American or white. This is an amazing story. So, if you will allow me, I'd like to continue. Jefferson Davis publicly denounced Lincoln's order, but it did, for the most part, have the desired effect, as most black prisoners were not treated with the harsh justice mandated by Confederate policies. So Lincoln's words did have an effect, even though the Confederacy never officially acknowledged African Americans as prisoners of war. Instead, what emerged were inconsistent practices in dealing with captured black troops, depending on the time, place, and the commander into whose hands they fell. Confederate officers encouraged the killing of African American soldiers rather than taking them prisoner. And the atrocities committed against surrendering black soldiers at Poison Spring, Fort Pillow, and Petersburg are now well known. If they were not executed, captured black soldiers often found themselves treated very differently from white prisoners. Instead of being confined to camps, many African American prisoners were put to forced labor. As Robert Jones, a black soldier captured at Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, recalled, quote, "They took me to Rust, Texas, where they had me at work doing every kind of work, loading steamboats, rebuilding breastworks, while I was in captivity." Unquote. Near Fort Gilmer, Virginia, captured black troops were forced to work under enemy fire in the trenches. In retaliation, the Union General Benjamin F. Butler placed an equal number of Confederate prisoners of war on forward trenches. Within a week, the black prisoners were removed from the front lines. That was their way of trying to protect the prisoners who had been fighting for the Union. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
So here's where the number 575 comes in.
Okay.
Okay, this is the number that somebody painted on the Johnny Rubber. I don't know if they know this story, if it's just a coincidence, if it has some different meaning. I don't know.
Whoever defaced that statue.
Or maybe it's SLS backwards or upside down. Anyway, slave owners were encouraged to retrieve their former slaves or receive restitution for those in service to the Confederacy. In October of 1864, the newspaper, the Mobile Advertiser and Register, listed the names of 575 black prisoners who were employed by the Engineer Corporation at Mobile, Alabama. The owners were notified in order to receive the pay due them.
So
people were being treated like property. Absolutely. It is think about the human trafficking stories we talk about today. It happens in a different way, but at least it's not legal. I mean, back then it was legal. The government was okay with it.
Yeah.
It is unknown if anyone answered the newspaper's call, but there were instances where soldiers were returned to their former owners. Owners!
Yeah.
William Rand was one of them. He was captured at Athens, Alabama in October 1864. This is what he wrote. "They started with us to Mobile, but at Tuscumbia, my old master found me and took me away from the soldiers and took me home and kept me there." Unquote. The historian Walter Williams recounts a number of instances in which black prisoners were enslaved, stating that one Confederate colonel ordered the sale of black captives with the proceeds to be divided among the soldiers.
My God.
Yeah, sell these guys and we'll just keep the money. We'll split it up.
Yeah, exactly.
You are not a human being. You
Human
are
trafficking back then.
and endorsed by the government,
Yeah, exactly.
the Confederate government.
Endorsed by the government.
And I know those people who want to tell me the the Northern government did it too. You are right. But at the time of the Civil War, they had stopped. That's the difference. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation only mentions the Southern states.
Yeah.
I've had that argument before. People will tell me the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the South. Well, because they were already free in the North. And yes, there were some in the North. And yes, the North did legally, they had no law against it.
Yeah.
So yes, there is guilty, but at that point in time, in the 1863, the states that were continuing to do it was the issue.
Yeah.
Let's see. While an unknown number of black prisoners were either pressed into Confederate service or returned to slavery, records mention African American troops being held in at least 9 Confederate prison camps, often segregated from the white prisoners. At Andersonville, about 100 black prisoners and their white officers established something called the Negro Squad, which segregated from the rest of the prisoners. Guards at Andersonville were notoriously hard on the prisoners who were African American. A quote from one of the white prisoners of war said the rebels refused to do anything for them, meaning the black soldiers. They received no medicine, no medical treatment. They were compelled to load and unload the dead who died daily in the stockade.
Oh, that's disgusting.
Oh, man. And this is not that long ago.
No.
To continue, black prisoners at Andersonville and other camps also faced the scorn of many of their white compatriots. This animosity was rooted in both racial attitudes and the belief that African American prisoners were the reason for the Union's refusal to conduct prisoner exchanges, a belief that had merit and was propagated by their captors. During the first 2 years of the war, captured soldiers were paroled and exchanged regularly, and there was no prisoner of war crisis. However, because the Confederacy refused to acknowledge African Americans as prisoners of war, it would not exchange them. As you know, they were being killed and or put back into slavery.
Yeah.
Confederate leaders argued that they were under no more obligation to return slaves than captured cannons
Gee.
or mules.
Wow.
They put them into the same category
Disgusting.
as cannons and mules. To exchange a black prisoner for a white one would imply a racial equality that was not something the Confederacy wanted to agree was true.
Disgusting.
Confederate unwillingness to exchange black prisoners played into Union hands, allowing the Lincoln administration to suspend prisoner exchanges until the Confederacy agreed to exchange black prisoners equally with whites. As the government in Richmond refused to negotiate on this basis, the numbers held in both Union and Confederate prison camps grew rapidly. Because of the Union's manpower advantage, the Union did not need prisoner of war swaps to replenish its ranks, but the Confederacy did. Lincoln, of course, could not state that it was military policy to leave tens of thousands of Union soldiers starving in Southern prison camps, but by refusing to exchange black prisoners, the Confederate government in effect gave Lincoln political cover to bleed the Confederate army dry. With the demise of the Confederacy, black prisoners of war were either paroled from the remaining Southern prison camps or simply walked away as their guards abandoned them. It's unknown how many black troops may have been executed after they surrendered. According to a congressional committee report, which underestimates, undoubtedly, the number of captured black soldiers, 79 black Union soldiers died in Confederate prisons. 77 escaped, 384 were recaptured by Union forces, 236 were paroled at the end of the war, and not one enlisted in the service of the enemy or deserted the flag of the country.
Gosh.
What I just read to you was written by Thomas J. Ward Jr., just to give him credit, and I found it in looking up the number, 575, which somebody painted on the Johnny Reb statue.
Oh, that's so horrible. This
So,
guy should go to jail.
Do you know, so many thoughts come to me when I read stories of war and the winners and losers, and I know they say that the history is always written by the victors. I don't know why the victors in the fight between European settlers and Native Americans, I don't know why the victors were victorious in that one. Mm-hmm. But I would like to think the victors were victorious in the Civil War because God saw that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It was the right thing to do so that we could have some freedom in this country as was promised.
Exactly.
For everybody, not
And
just
to
for
remember
not just for certain people.
that we're free.
Anyway, whatever you think of that statue in the park, it does represent some really strong feelings. It's not just history; it's some really, really, really strong feelings. So just keep that in mind when you are thinking about what you think about things that represent a time in our history that anybody with any common sense would say it's certainly a period in our history that we should have some shame for.
Yeah.
Glenn Beck coming up next. We'll be back tomorrow. This is The Source, WOCA Ocala.
From the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA Ocala.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. He's said to have preached in person to more people than anyone in history. The Reverend Billy Graham died, 99 years old, at his home in North Carolina.
President Trump paying his respects to evangelist Billy Graham, writing on Twitter, "The great Billy Graham is dead. There was nobody like him. He will